Okay, I think we're good. Okay.
Are you rolling?
I think so. I was told I am.
Yeah.
Alright, thank you. So we're looking at Psalm 30 today, and there's a copy of that going around for those of you who just walked in. For those of you who haven't been, I see a couple people who have been in class before. Welcome. But this, just so you know what you're holding, is my translation of Psalm 30, and we've been working from those when we do this, so feel free to reference or access another translation like alongside it, but the idea there is that we'll be able to sort of explore the dynamics of the poetry in a different way and get a handle on the language and what it's doing, and see that the Psalms and the poetry especially are very flexible in how they can be rendered. Probably the most flexible language in the whole Bible in terms of how many different ways you can translate it and still be on point. But this just gives us something to work from that is fresh. As an introduction, I guess, to what we're talking about today, I'll just recall where we've been in the last couple of weeks. So, after looking at Psalm 1 as an introduction to the Psalms and getting a sort of angle on the Psalter as an instruction book about prayer, or an instruction book about the life of faith, we moved to talking about, in 2 successive weeks, 2 different kinds of praise, or we looked at praise through 2 different lenses, right? First we looked at Psalm 146, that praise that celebrates God's activity in transforming lives, transforming social situations, and that does it through telling stories about it, through announcing the kinds of things that God does. We looked at Psalm 104, as that was the big one. Remember the big creation psalm that was descriptive in nature and used description and observation and a sense of place and location in the world. Especially that the human perspective is very minimized in Psalm 104. Remember the sense that the world is huge and there's so much to creation, and the human drama is really only one of many. And that was one way of praising. So those kinds of texts we talked about as being ways that communities form their imaginations about the kinds of things that God does and the way that the world really works. We talked about praise as a challenge to the community, making claims in community that have to be confirmed or negotiated by the community about the kinds of things God does or doesn't do. So praise being an activity that the church or the individual engages in as a sort of matter of routine, right? Not out of a specific situation, but as a matter of constantly negotiating our faith and our convictions about the nature of God. Lament, on the other hand, is where we were last week. We looked at Psalm 6. Psalm 6 being this prayer that issues from what we discerned was a situation very much of isolation and abandonment, possibly sickness, but certainly the sense that this prayer is informed by a sense not only of distance from God, but from the community around them, from their friends possibly, from everyone, really, that their life has been reduced effectively to death, in the sense that their life doesn't mean anything anymore to anyone, that they've been forgotten. That situation of lament, that kind of prayer, calling out and asking for God to help on the basis of God's own character, to call God to get involved because God owes it to us through the covenant relationship that the Psalms presume. That kind of speech is what we call protest or lament prayer, and that's what leads us to what we're going to look at this week, which is Psalm 30, which represents what we sometimes call the Thanksgiving Psalms. And I would characterize the kind of prayer we're looking at this week as a sort of instruction about when God answers prayer. And what I want to highlight for us this week, just in the background, is the Thanksgiving Psalms are important instruction about how to celebrate and announce and articulate that God has answered prayer, but they don't presume that God answers prayer all the time, necessarily. And I want to keep that in the backs of our minds, that There are other songs that are aware and understand and are clear about the fact that God often doesn't answer prayer in the way that we'll see in Psalm 30 today. So this is one kind of speech, again, that the community engages in. I want us to think as we hear this song about all the other voices we've heard so far in this class from the Psalter. Voices of lament, for instance. One of the things I really want us to be attentive to today, just as we hear the song and as we think through it, is just to make sure that as we hear this one mode of speech, we always remember that prayer and the life of faith take place in community, right? And we've been emphasizing this in every psalm that we've looked at so far. In other words, each prayer takes place in a world where other prayers are being prayed at all times. And I think sometimes when the Psalms get read, there's such a focus on whatever's being read that we sort of forget to negotiate the complex reality of the fact that when people are announcing that prayers have been answered, some people are still lamenting. Some people have been lamenting for 30 years about the same thing. Some people have felt abandoned a long time, and other people prayed last week and are giving thanks today for the answer to that prayer. Those kinds of realities sort of undergird the Psalms in that they are, remember, a song book, right? They're a collection of voices that stand in tension and yet in harmony with each other. And that politics of prayer, I think, is what the Psalms as a whole speak to. They have the ability to provide witness to the many forms that the life of faith can take, and yet that it can take in community, right? That we can stay together in that complexity. So as we hear this particular voice, remember those other voices we've heard so far, and think about other possible perspectives on this prayer. Because as we'll see, this is a prayer that doesn't just take place in private, but actually the individual brings into a community. And think about those dynamics. Think about what it would mean for this prayer to be prayed in community. Those are introductory remarks just to sort of get us online. I'll read the song now, and I'll just ask y'all to just listen to the song and see what stands out to you, and then we'll talk about that as usual. So this is Psalm 30. I will exalt you, Yahweh, for you've drawn me up, and have not let my enemies rejoice over me. Yahweh, my God, I cried out to you, and you healed me. Yahweh, you raised up my life from Sheol. You restored my life from among those gone down to the pit. Sing praise to Yahweh, his faithful ones. Give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is for a moment, but his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but in the morning a shout of joy. But as for me, I said in my comfort, I will never be shaken. Yahweh, in your favor, you have made me to stand firm like a mighty mountain. You hid your face, and I was terrified. To you, Yahweh, I cried out. To my Lord, I made supplication. What profit is there in my blood, in my going down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it declare your faithfulness? Listen, Yahweh, be gracious to me. Yahweh, be a helper to me. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You've taken off my sackclothes and clothed me with joy, so that my whole being will sing praise to you and not be silent. O Yahweh, my God, I will praise you forever. So, what stands out to you about this song?
It's conversational.
Oh yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, like he's telling, almost like he would expect an answer. I say he, but anyway, the psalmist is saying, I love you and I'm lifted up and all these good things come to me and I really want you to know that. And how delighted I am.
So there's a dynamic of this is being communicated to other people. Like,
Yes, yeah.
Are you talking about to God primarily?
Well, both, but like he's not being unctuous, but saying to God, like these are all the good things that have come to me, and in a very sincere way.
Right,
And
right.
of course, reminding, like, if you didn't give these things to me, what good would it do anybody,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah, that is interesting. Thank you. Yeah,
What stood out to me is that he starts off saying, he's been in a bad place, and then all this singing about, Yahweh done good to him. And then suddenly there, verse 10 and 11, he's having second thoughts, like maybe he's gonna be thrown down into the pit.
yeah, well,
And then
yeah.
wraps it up with, returning to
Right.
gratefulness.
The Thanksgiving Psalms, as we'll see in a minute, it's important to understand how their structure works, to understand them, and this is why, so sorry to keep railing against it, but this is why reading Psalms in fragmentation is often difficult for understanding how they're working. So, because the flow of this psalm actually, it has a particular function for each part that will make a little bit more sense in a minute of the bump you're getting there, like why it seems like there's a back and forth. So that's extremely important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second.
Sounds like the psalmist has been suicidal in verse 10, really in a very bad place.
Yeah, absolutely.
I kind of looked at 10 and 11 like we did like last week of the relationship or the need between God and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I die
Yeah,
and I'm not here anymore, who's going to sing your praise?
yeah, right,
And so
That's the
that
logic of
jumped
that
out at
prayer,
me again.
right. Yeah, that's a great connection. We'll talk more about that, yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So, but line 1, reading line 1 and reading the psalm, the rest of it doesn't seem to go together. It's not what
The
I would have
superscription,
expected
you
to a
mean?
dedication of a temple, that this is
yeah.
what you would write.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. So we've a long time ago we talked a little bit about superscriptions, and we talked about how the superscriptions are certainly later additions to the Psalms. We know that because we have manuscript evidence of later additions with them and without. Right. This is clearly from the Hasmonean period, where the temple is being rededicated, and this psalm has been reappropriated to that purpose. So this dedication, or this superscription, reflects a secondary use of this psalm, at least a secondary, maybe even later. But clearly, some community, the Jewish community, found this psalm particularly appropriate for celebrating that occasion. And I think you're very right that it's interesting because it's a first-person psalm as we read it, right? So it stands out that community would have, one of the ways they were using it was to sing together that this was a shared plight contained in this eye, right? That as they restored the temple, that's a deliverance that they've been praying for as a community. So that's certainly one way that the individual psalms were used, and the superscription highlights that. But it is, to be clear, totally disconnected from the creation of the song.
Okay.
But, go ahead, Ben.
It's sort of, and maybe this is a stretch, but when you were talking about the politics of prayer, the tension of a person being in a lamentful place and a person being in a thanksgiving place, the psalm itself sort of has some of that. It sort of has an internal politics unto itself where there are various stages of the development of this person's life cycle of,
Absolutely.
There's some history, there's some lament, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me? There's some, hey, thanks God, you've saved my life.
Right.
And it's all sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, it's so vivid. Like sometimes if I pray, I just assume God knows everything. But this really paints the picture of like there's joy and there's despair, and I'm so happy, and I want everybody to know it.
Right.
I'm afraid of I have deep fears. It's really
Yeah, there's definitely storytelling going on. It's that the idea last week we talked about. There's no presumption that God doesn't need to hear these things proclaimed in community, that God already knows them or whatever. There's a real emotional life of human beings that God wants us to proclaim and talk about and discuss in community. And get the
And
sense God means
also,
prayer.
also our attitude, my attitude that God is a gentle God, and why would God withdraw this from me? But this psalmist
Right.
reminds me that God may, right? Kind of like the story of Job, like, you know, God may just
Right?
give and take.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Also liturgically, you know, at least for Episcopalians or people inclined to evening, morning prayer, when we end a psalm, we end with the Gloria Patri, you know, glory to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. So that prayer of anamnesis, of sort of God in all times, is an echo of that sort of politics. It's sort of interesting to think of the, you know, inherent tension in this psalm of
Right.
here's what was, here's what is, here's what's going to be.
Yeah.
And God's present to all of those moments in time. And so liturgically, we frame that with the Gloria Patri. I don't know, it just popped in my head that
Yeah, absolutely.
it's anamnetical in that way, that as it was in the past is now, will be forever.
Personally, this is why we're striking a little bit on one of the reasons why my cards on the table. Thanksgivings are my favorite to study. I think they're some of the most overlooked, complicated, artistic, but generally very oversimplified prayers. Like people, I think it's one of the most simple kinds of prayer, that you would just say thanks for something. But these are really politically, theologically complex because they involve centrally telling a story about a very complex story about moments that were theologically complicated and tense. The psalm does not resolve all the questions about what the psalmist has been through, or whether God was just in doing this or that, or how long the psalmist had to wait, or why God answered the prayer. There's a lot of complex issues that get looked over here, and as I drew our attention to, one of the larger complex issues of Thanksgiving is its life politically in the church, like in a community, right? That all those questions are their own set of questions that have to be a larger set of questions that other people have. Like negotiating answered prayer is really, I think, a difficult space, but where the community really becomes vulnerable to each other in learning to look for those moments where God has acted and to celebrate with each other. We'll definitely keep talking about this tension and unfolding the structure of the song. Was there anybody didn't get to say something that they wanted to? Yeah.
So, I'm not sure if this is a fully formed thought yet, so forgive me if it rambles a little bit. You mentioned in the beginning that this is your translation, so I think
This is.
I think what I have is a translation question.
Okay.
I ran out just to get something to bear down on, and it turned out that I grabbed
Holy Bible.
but I grabbed the version, the message that's the everyday
Oh,
life
yeah.
translation
Yeah.
that's really easy
That's
to
Eugene
read
Peterson,
from
yeah.
Peterson,
Right.
I guess. And so I opened it up just out of curiosity, and in your translation, sort of around verse 7, where it's, you know, I said, in my comfort I will never be shaken.
Right.
And in your favor you made me to stand firm. You hid your face and I was terrified. And then I cried out to you. In the other version that I happened to grab, there's a transition word, there's a then,
Oh,
which
okay.
makes it sound a little bit more causal, maybe. So the translation is, when things were going great, I crowed. I've got it made. I'm God's favorite. He
That's
made
in verse
me
7.
the king of the mountain. Then you looked the other way, and I fell to pieces. And that then makes me wonder, like, is there a sense of like, is this just me reading too much and staring at two translations side by side, or was there a choice there as you translated? Or
Yeah,
I'm just
absolutely.
curious.
Oh yeah, there was
You could talk
always a
about
choice.
yeah. Could you talk about that?
Yeah.
a little bit?
And when
Curious.
when translating poetry, I can't see all go at once in any position. So, there we go. When translating poetry, and especially the Psalms and Hebrew poetry is actually much more compact than English poetry. So like, for several words, you might just have one in Hebrew. So you hid your face is just this one word. Well, it's two technically, but there's definitely there's a transitional that might mean then or something like that. And I think that's what's being looked at. But but the verb is it's a punch, which is why I tried to strip down and keep it to the simplicity of the words in the Hebrew. Peterson, of course, is paraphrasing and trying to bring out more feeling in it, and that's one way of translating Psalms, is trying to bring out some emotions in English idiom, right, which is what he's trying to do. But I try at least just to represent, in my translations, try to represent the Hebrew as best as possible, which is not Peterson's goal, so that's the contrast you're seeing. But there are different objectives for different kinds of translations. Here, though, it's, in that particular case, then is fine, it wouldn't make a big difference, but the reason I have it as I have it here is to highlight the starkness of the transition, which, whether you have then or not, is, I think, still clear, but what I'm trying to show is that the psalmist is telling this story and goes extremely quickly from not just being in a good place, but God putting this person in a good place and preserving him there. You had made me to stand firm like a mighty mountain wall. You hid your face. And I think that quick transition is a part of that's the big theological complexity of the story being told. I think there's just no other information. And this is where Psalms, I think, get their worst interpretations. This is where people fill in the blanks in ways that are drawn not from the Psalm, but from whatever popular notions of God or theology they might have. So they assume that you fill in the blanks. That's the best way to say it. The Psalms leave so many blanks that people immediately are like, well, this person must have done something wrong. Or, oh, yeah, they were arrogant. Things fell apart for them. Because we have cultural stories about pride leading to, destruction or whatever. So we kind of fill that in here. And I'm trying to highlight that the Psalm actually leaves quite a bit of space to negotiate what's being captured. I think one of the reasons is the Psalms haven't been edited to be used in many situations. So it doesn't highlight that this is specifically the lament of someone who a particular kind of crisis happened to. It highlights the fact that life is fragile, and that for many people, both good and bad, both pious and not pious, life can change like that. And I think this psalm captures that in its brief rhetoric.
It also holds up a complexity about God, that God is paradoxical. And I kind of find that refreshing. The then can be implied, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And that, to sort of, it's almost like a list. God does this, God does this, God does this, God does this.
Yeah.
And it creates that tension.
Yeah.
God makes me stand firm like a mountain, God hides God's face,
Yeah.
and I shake like a leaf.
Right.
And they both happen at once.
Yeah, I think that's right. The psalm does it as a narrative, but I think it's important and appropriate to remember that the human experience of the life of faith often involves our attention is drawn to particular things going on in our life that, this person might be established in almost all the ways they were prior, and yet it feels like God is in God's face in a particular way or whatever. Like that, those two things can overlap, and the complexity of what we highlight at a given moment or what's being highlighted in our life, I think, is present here.
And since these are written from, these carry weight now, but they were also written at a particular time in response to particular events. So can we talk about those who went down to the pit?
Yeah.
What was the context of when was it written historically, or
Right.
where does it fit in with what was?
Yeah, the pit is an image. It's a very ambiguous general image. There are different arguments made about what it literally refers to, but poetically it references that common view of the afterlife that we talked about last week. Sheol is in parallel to it here, which helps us know what's being referred to. So that's Sheol is one way of saying it. The pit is another. Going down to the pit means dying. Like it means being forsaken, which and a faithful person dying is an image of forsakenness or abandonment by God. And going down to the pit, I mean, there are literal interpretations that refer to like the way that bones were actually disposed of in the ancient world, in ancient Israel. These pits where you were gathered to your fathers, quite literally, like where bodies were put together, that it might be part of the image, but it's generally a picture of a place that you can't get out of. And it's ambiguous. It's not morally weighted. It's not a place of hell, torture, and it's not a good place either. It's just down there. It's away from God, and it's out of the living. And that itself is the destination wants to be avoided by the psalmist. There's a very high view of life itself in the Psalms, and there's no real view of afterlife being a place that I'm happy to go.
Chronologically, does it fit? Is this during the exile? Is it
yeah,
about Babylon?
yeah,
Is
we
it
don't
about, or just, we don't know?
Yeah, we don't know. This could be dated anywhere in the span of 500 years. Seriously, the Psalm 30 and some psalms like it, it's pretty clear that nope. The superscription is clear when it would have had to be written by or until, but the rest of the psalm gives almost no stamp for when it was written or when it was used. Sheol is not something. Well, that would have been used in many centuries. I mean, that's a widespread belief for a long time. If it's all right, let's transition and walk through and look at how the structure of the psalm works, just briefly, to get our heads around how it moves. And this, I think, will help get us into a discussion about its theology a little bit, because as we've already discovered, and as we've been alluding to, the structure of the song is a big part of its message, how it does its thing. So, first of all, I want to draw our attention to the frame of the psalm. And we've talked about psalms having frames before, how the beginning and end often work together to show you the real function of the song. In this case, on the number of verses I've handed out to you, at least, verses 2 through 4 and verses 12 through 13 kind of function as the frame of the song. And they both serve a similar function. They're first-person prayers, right, directed directly to God. So God is the audience of these moments in the song, and the psalmist is the voice, the singular voice. So the first action of this song is, I will exalt you, I will give thanks to you, right? There's an immediate response to this event in the psalmist's life of transformation, and the first gut response, at least, that the psalm draws attention to is the psalmist's own voice thanking God. And there's a brief sort of compact version of the narrative there in verses 3 and 4. What God hasn't done is verse 2, you haven't let my enemies rejoice over me, right? But then you have the story, and this operates as a sum of the rest of the psalm, essentially. I cried out to you, that's past, I offered this prayer, and you healed me. You raised my life up from Sheol. You restored my life from among those gone down to the pit. So it's a narrative declaration of what has happened. Versus, compared to the praise psalms we've looked at, more description, right, of what always happens, or what is happening currently all the time. So this is drawing our attention to a particular narrative moment in history where God's character can be understood. It's a different kind of praise then from what we see in the praise songs that meditate on how God always is and all the time. This psalm kind of stands in tension with that reality, right? This psalm tells a story of when God wasn't sustaining an individual. But then there's this important move we have to understand in verse 5 that says a lot about what the psalm is actually for. Verse 2 through 4, they're the first opening prayer by the psalmist, but there's this turn, right, in verse 5. Sing praise to Yahweh, his faithful ones. Give thanks to his holy name. This is an invitation to the community now, right? This is a very important turn for this prayer. It's not just an individual saying thank you to God, or declaring what God's done for them, but rather it's a move from wherever they are, from their place of isolation, from their household, wherever, to the communal space in which they'll now announce this story. And that, I think, this is a little bit just complicated, but I think it's one of the most profound theological aspects of the Thanksgiving Psalms, is that they call for, in the life of a community of faith, they call for individuals to bring their stories into community, to tell them to the community, and for the community to negotiate those stories about God. That dynamic is, I think, one of the most difficult things about the life of the Christian community as a whole. That we don't just sing praises about what we all agree God does in community, we actually tell stories about what life with God has been like for me, and what life with God has been like for that person. We tell stories about laments we prayed, and how they were answered, or how they weren't. And we negotiate those things. And that complexity is, I think, another part of the way that the community has a unity, that we actually gather around each person's story as much as we gather around our story as a whole. And those two things work together, at least according to the Psalms, that those two kinds of prayers are both kinds of prayers that we pray. So here's that move in verses 5 through 6, right? The turn, the invitation, listen to my story and respond with praise, right? And the implications of what's happened to this person are verse 6. And this is where this person, praying their prayer, singing to the community that they should also praise according to what they've said, this is where they do a little bit of theological teaching based on their experience. They don't just say, man, I prayed last week and things are better now, like celebrate with me. They actually move to instruct and to say, and as a result of my experience, I've got something to say about God to the community. I've got a word about the kind of God that we're involved with. And my word is, his anger is for a moment, but his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but in the morning, a shout of joy. There's this contrast, right? These two parallelisms that try to highlight how the chaotic aspect of the life of faith with God is overwhelmed by, ultimately, God's faithfulness, God's ability to provide or sustain. And I'll bring our attention back now to the fact that I think for the whole psalm, this might be the most politically charged and tense moment in a community, right? To announce what has happened, what God has done, and then to exegete that event and say, let me tell y'all something. God's anger, it's just for a moment, but his favor is for a lifetime. And I can't help but read the psalm with people in mind who have experienced crisis for a lot longer than a moment without any relief. And it just, for me at least, wrestling with this kind of rhetoric and the fact that in community it is appropriate and good and true to announce that about God, and yet to hold that in tension with the reality of suffering, I think is one of the most important and responsible things we can do with Thanksgiving Psalms, and not over-reduce them to the neglect of those other voices in our community that continue. To the Psalm 6s, right? To the prayers that are still being prayed, the prayers that were answered in this case. So 5 and 6 are this announcement to the community to get involved, but the second turn occurs here, and this will help, I think, make sense of some of the complexity of the Psalm's perspectives. The move in verse 7 is then to tell the story, right? And this is key for understanding how Thanksgiving works with the Psalms. So if the Psalms are a book of instruction about prayer, this is one of their primary instructions. When we thank God, it's not about saying, I am so thankful. Let me describe now how thankful I am. Like, that, I think, is a very, when we think of thankfulness or gratitude in our culture, I think we often think about ways that we can express just how grateful we are. Does that make sense? So we engage in activities or words or whatever that attempt to just really convey, like, the depth of my gratitude. But the Psalms put the focus the other way. To say thank you in the Psalms, to give a prayer of thanks, is not about expressing just how grateful I am, but about telling stories about what this person has done, about what God has done. So the psalmist moves in the middle of the prayer to say thank you the right way and tells the story, not just to God, but to the community. This, I think, by the way, has implications for the way as Christians we think about gratitude in general and how it should be expressed and the posture of what it means to be grateful. To tell stories about the things we're grateful for, rather than to tell stories about how thankful we are, is just a different angle on that virtue. But I think this song models it particularly well, because this turn in verses 7 through 11, and that whole section, is to tell this story of the situation, and then culminate in the end with what God did about it. So this story begins with where I was before, right? In my comfort, I said, I will never be shaken. I had been made to stand firm like a mighty mountain, but you hid your face. And I cried out, I made supplication, I prayed. And then verses 10 through 11 are that prayer. This is the psalmist quoting to the community of the prayer that they prayed, because it's a very important part of the story, right? If I'm in a community, not to make this, well, yeah, I'll just put it this way. But if you're in a community where someone's saying their prayer has been answered, I think there's a very practical sense in which you want to know what they said, or what the prayer was, you know. And not to put it this way, but you kind of want to know what works with God, right? I mean, Psalm 30 is a psalm about something that worked, something that got God to act. And there's a sort of instruction there too by the psalmist that Thanksgiving is a venue for teaching the community about the kinds of concerns God has, the way that God responds to certain kinds of crises, and what kind of prayer is good for asking for help. And as we see here, it's the same kind of prayer we saw in Psalm 6. The negotiation is about God's own life being at stake, not about the psalmist's. The psalmist turns the situation of their life into a problem for God's own life. And that is the critical move in Psalms of Lament that we talked about last week. To say, what profit is there in my blood? If I die, what good is that for you? Your faithfulness is compromised. Your character will be compromised. This story won't get told, and other stories will get told. Stories of abandonment. And the community won't have this story to know this about you. So prove yourself. Show yourself faithful like you have before. The call then is for God to act like God. And this is exactly what Sharon preached about from the gospel 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the woman who negotiates with Jesus to act for her, asking for him to be Jesus. Act like who you are. That's the lament psalms. You know, is the plea that God show up as God, and act as God should act, according to what God has said God will do. So you get the prayer of that nature in verses 10 through 11, and finally the climax of the story, right? But you have turned my mourning into dancing. You responded. You've taken off my sackclothes and clothed me with joy. My whole being will sing praise to you. O Yahweh my God, I'll praise you forever. There's this culmination of the narrative, and that's the end of the Thanksgiving. That the story is told, climax is reached, and that's the celebration as a whole. It's a narrative form. So that's a little bit about how the structure of the song works. How does that strike y'all? And what emerges for you now that we walked through that a little bit? Does that clarify anything, or
Makes more sense.
raise questions, or?
Well, I think you're talking about how it's structured that way as the instruction and kind of how the right way to pray, but I think it's also a fundamentally human reaction.
Mm.
Like this series of reaction is fundamentally, I mean, having personally gone through a serious medical crisis recently, you know, I can see each stage basically in there, and the relief and the kind of, you know, you talk about the anger for a moment lines, and it you know, the suffering can last a lot longer than a moment, but you know, they've done studies about how you remember in a crisis the worst point and the last point, right? And that's your impression of what that experience was. So it can feel like, oh, that was just a moment, and now we're moving on, you know, and that relief and that moving through and wanting to tell the story and that kind of thing. So that kind of human progression through that is very evident to me.
Thanks, that's great. Yes.
And you can see what, so they took it and used it to repurpose an older psalm for a temple dedication. fits very well.
Yeah, right,
Israel coming back out.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, there's, it sort of begs the question for me of two things. One is, what's a moment? How do we sort of wrap our minds around that? As you've said, somebody's still lamenting something for 30 years.
Yeah.
I kind of get that part. My dad died when I was a young man, and then I carry that lament with me. Other things not. So, or there's resolution to other things in different kinds of ways. But it also sort of begs the question of the maybe the ultimate question: God, be who you say you are. How do we all answer that? How do we say who God is? And so I don't know. It's a weird sort of struggle that I have, particularly in the sense that I'm not sure I've experienced relief from my struggle. And so God is what? Who is God in that? Just my long-suffering companion. Another 30 years, pal. Okay. Or what? I don't know. I mean, it raises some interesting and thorny questions about how God, who is God? What am I asking God to be?
Absolutely. That's definitely that's some of the questions I'm getting at by pointing especially to verse 6 as, if you notice, and we have, but verse 6 is the only, it's the only pure theology of the psalm. It's the only pure theological discourse where just sort of straight up claim is made in the sense of the Psalm 104, like the praise for just how things are, right? It's a wisdom teaching. It's a proverb about just how things work. And we've talked about how wisdom is so nice and simple because it just so happily makes binaries out of everything. And that's just really very nice worldview to maintain. It's just very helpful to making sense of the complexities, and yet so easy to problematize, right? And so easy to just, what use is that? The world is not binary. The world doesn't work this way. It's not righteous and wicked, right? And this teaching in verse 6, I think, is of that same genre where it's the kind of thing that humans say to describe the world. In the midst, or in light of their experience. It's not speculative or philosophically complicated. It's an observation about how things seem to have worked. And it's based on experience, fundamentally, not on doctrine necessarily, but rather on, this is what I've seen in my time, that anger is for a moment and favor is for a lifetime. That weeping stays for the night, but joy shows up in the morning. And I think that it's worth keeping in mind that there are different, as we've been saying, different modes of speech or different kinds of language in the Psalms. It's just important to recognize the place in this Psalm of that verse. This is the kind of verse that shows up on the back of t-shirts out of context. And it doesn't help anybody because this verse has a context. It's in a prayer. It's coming from the voice of one who has been delivered, not from the voice of one who's been weeping for months on end, right? It's a certain kind of theological voice. You can't just pluck it out and say, well, we have a doctrine in Scripture about weeping, and it's that it lasts for the night, but joy will be there in the morning. It's not.
So get over it.
Right? Yeah. No, this is one voice, and it comes from a particular kind of situation. And what I would highlight is that it's a valid and true theological claim. But that theology takes the form of the people who make it, us, and we're diverse. We're made up of different experiences of God. Maybe not, maybe, but I would say wholly contradictory experiences of God. I don't know. I think that at the end of the day is what holds the Psalms together, that there are claims the Psalms agree on at the end of the day. God is faithful in the Psalms. And for some voices, it's in the morning, and for other voices, almost never. Psalm 88 ends with no turn to praise. It's a lament that just drops off. Some people think the psalmist died while writing it. Which is the ultimate image of abandonment. A prayer for help that ends in, can't even finish the prayer. So there's such a spectrum of these claims about how God acts. But the fact that the Psalter contains that, I think, speaks loudly about the kind of theological tradition we preserve. And I think it speaks sharply to uses of verses like this as sort of a sweeping doctrine of how pain works or how prayer works. The Psalms are made up of different voices on that matter, and they have different times when they're appropriate. That's one thing I'd say in response to some of those questions, is just never to stop reading all the Psalms. Not all, but never to stop reading the Psalms as a part of the Psalter, as a part of a community of voices. Never to hang too long onto one teaching about God, but to also listen to the voice of Psalm 6. To hear those together. I think that's the kind of hope the Psalms give a prayer like Psalm 88. But what else do y'all think?
It's always darkest before the dawn. Kind of says that.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Or saying
Well,
more about
weeping
it?
may stay for the night, but in
Yeah.
the morning, a shout of joy. It's always darkest before the dawn.
Yeah.
Then you have another night and
Well,
another,
that's
and
true.
another day.
Right.
So to me, it's a little bit, doesn't end with one day and one night.
But what Megan said before about the medical or an illness or that crisis, it does sound like somebody who's been tested, and they're better. And like how you draw close, like to when you're fearful and then when you're happy. Well, maybe it doesn't quite say that, but that's my experience with that. Then when I'm better, I'm prayerful and attentive. But then when things are better, it's easy to be slack. And yet this person shows real joy and demonstrates that. And I like that.
Yeah, there's been an observation in scholarship of the Psalms that sort of persists, and that is that there's really only truly like 6 or 7 individual songs of thanksgiving in the Psalms. There are a lot of laments. I mean, there's like 50 or 60, if I remember correctly, individual lament prayers in the Psalms. They're the overwhelming majority of the type of prayer that you get in the Psalter, as we discussed. There's really only a couple of these. Scholars have had different reactions to this fact, but one of the earlier reactions by a really famous form critic who kind of determined and identified these different genres, just said, this is easily explained. Humans don't say thank you very much. And people have wrestled with that remark for a long time, because he just sort of made it and kept going in this 1,000-page book he wrote. But it's an interesting thought. I think it's a very culturally rooted thought, but provocative only in the sense of, I think the Psalms have a lot of lament because lament is needed by humans very frequently. And I think that they have only a few Thanksgivings, perhaps because maybe there's not as many ways to tell the story of deliverance or transformation for what we were just talking about. The fact that in hindsight, crisis really does collapse into a couple points of major transition and at past deliverance. Does that make sense? But in crisis, it is so complex, and I think maybe the volume of lament prayers speaks to that. I also think it's an affirmation that, of exactly what that scholar said, but the opposite. So that was very wrong. Or that we shouldn't feel guilty about that, is what I'm saying. So that scholar was like, humans should be more thankful, But I think the Psalms kind of recognize that the life of prayer, it's okay for your prayer life to mostly consist of asking for help. And it's okay, we shouldn't carry the guilt of not being thankful enough for the ways that God takes care of us. God is joyful about taking care of us, and it's God's work to take care of us. Thanking God profusely for being who God is in relation to the humans God created doesn't make a lot of sense, in the sense that, and this does go against a lot of ways we hear Christian theology talked about a lot of time, like everything from God is just a total gift because we're such scum and we don't deserve anything. I hear that a lot in more popular renditions of Christianity, but the Psalms just seem to think that we are entitled to a certain amount of help from God as His creatures, and that's a loving dynamic. And that Thanksgiving is appropriate, but that God's not passive-aggressively waiting for us to say thank you either. I mean, there's a degree of faithfulness involved in that relationship, and not everything is a gift in that sense. It's God acting like God, and that's why the lament psalms can pray the way they do. Show up. And there's a promise of thanks usually, but I think God takes joy in answering prayer, not necessarily in the payoff as such. That's not the point. So it's just to say that Thanksgiving models for us the real end I think God is hoping for when God acts faithfully toward us, and that is, again, not to express just how thankful we are, but to tell the story, right? To create a story and to tell it about God so that God's character can be known, clarified, and revealed in a different medium than we get in praise or our hymn book or whatever on Sunday. So that would be the virtue, I think, the Psalms of Thanksgiving seek to instill, that we tell stories about God and about God's work in our lives, and that when we pray for help, that we would go and tell it to the community that happened and that God answered. Any other questions or things that are standing out to you all? We have just a minute or two left. Or a couple minutes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like how you, in your translation, kind of get rid of some of what I consider fluff. Like, for instance, 11 in the Book of Common Prayer, which we use. I guess this is the one, yeah. 11, hear, O Lord, and have mercy on me. This is kind of stuff we've been hearing forever in prayers. That's vague compared to, listen, Yahweh, and be gracious to me. I mean, that just really perks me up to hear this. Your translation, be a helper to me. This is the kind of thing I'd say to my husband, damn it, help me, I need help.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just so...
But it follows that part where he said, what good would it do for, for me to suffer,
Right.
not be here to praise you.
And you're highlighting as well a way that the translation you're looking at is just wrong. And to say be merciful. This is one of the major translation errors of the NRSV is to continue rendering this verb chanan as have mercy on me. There's no penitence in this prayer. And have mercy is a penitential kind of prayer in Christianity, in modern Christianity. It's a posture of, please withhold your wrath, right? Like withhold something. Don't do the punishment you're doing, or have mercy. Take this off of me. No, this is be gracious, which means act, positively act for me. There's no semblance of a sign that there's penitence here, right? There's no like, I'm sorry, please take away this crisis. No, this is a totally different instruction to say, be gracious. It's just to call God to do God's work and deliver, right? And be a helper is the same positive formulation. Show up, behave a certain way. Very different from have mercy. So there are certain prayers where it's appropriate, but seriously like 2 or 3 in the whole Psalms that actually are praying for mercy because one has sinned or something like that. But be gracious is a totally different kind of prayer. Thanks for pointing that out. This has been really nice. Thank you all for this discussion. For next week, I'd like to look at a little bit different, take a little bit of a different direction, and look at Psalm 15, which is, well, we'll see when we get there, but it's pretty short, and it's a sort of a worship song, like a meditational song about the character of a person in the community of faith. So a little bit different than what we've been looking at. Not really a prayer. So Psalm 15. But that's it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.